The night of Owero's delivery was a special and happy one. She had waited for a child of her own after 10 years of marriage, and now cradled in her hands, she had been blessed with a beautiful girl. Owero named her beautiful girl Nwendo, which means our helper. Nwendo grew up in the village of Umuji. Growing into her childhood, she played with all other kids in the village, both male and female. She was known by the villagers for her very playful demeanor, but also striking beauty. But there was something different about Nwendo that set her apart from other kids in the village. She possessed both masculine and feminine traits, and she was a very smart girl. She had learned to take care of herself and clean herself by the age of 3, and at the age of 4, she could wash and bathe herself. However, her quick-wittedness and speedy growth was not a cause for alarm. But even if her face was feminine and girlish, the way Nwendo acted, moved and spoke were not anything but boyish. Her mum Owero saw nothing wrong about the behavior of her daughter and never had any suspicions, until one evening, Nwendo was playing with her male friends in front of the hut. Soon all the kids decided to ease themselves, and when they all gathered to pee in group, Nwendo joined them and urinated just like them. "Ah, Nwendo, don't you know you're a girl?" her mother said, running to Nwendo. But to her surprise, she saw Nwendo urinating with a male organ. "Ah, what is this?" her mother screamed, and she called on the villagers who gathered around Nwendo. "Ah, abomination! A child with both male and female parts." "Accursed child!" they screamed, and before Nwendo could finish peeing, she was already mobbed and carried by the sadistic mob of villagers towards the king's palace. As they arrived carrying Nwendo, Nwendo searched for her mother's face in the crowds but couldn't find her. The king of the village came out with the priest of the village. "Where is the abomination?" he said, and the men of the village carried Nwendo out. "My priest have spoken with the gods, and they have spoken. The cursed child must be cast into the Obonga River, away from the village at this very instant." The villagers cheered in excitement, and Nwendo's heart raced. Pounding loudly in her chest, she was scared, and as she looked around, her eyes finally fell on her mother, who was crying in a corner, being comforted by 2 other women. Nwendo called for her mom. "Mama, mama!" But Owero never looked at Nwendo as she was carried by the mob of villagers towards the river. They got in their local canoes and rowed into the river. Nwendo was in tears and fear because of the tales of the deadly creatures she had been told dwelled inside the river. But the men on the boat carrying her to her execution looked at her like a disaster waiting to be gotten rid of. As they got to the middle of the Obonga River, they threw Nwendo in. She flapped her hands trying to stay afloat, calling back the men on the boat to help. But they only looked at her with a mischievous smile on their faces. The villagers rowed the boat away from her, watching her wail and scream for help. As the boat rowed away, she struggled to stay afloat. Her hands were getting weaker and weaker. After a few minutes of struggling to stay afloat, Nwendo started to shiver and turn pale. But as she was about to give up, luckily, she saw another boat heading in her direction. She screamed weakly with her childlike voice, and the people on the boat heard her. As they approached her, it was clear to Nwendo that they were all men also in the boats, but with new faces from another village. They sailed close to her and pulled her out of the water. "Young girl, how did you end up here?" said one of them as he covered her with his big leopard fur clothes. They sailed into their village, and when they arrived and got settled in, Nwendo told her story to the men who helped her. They looked at her with sympathy and accepted her into the village. In the new village, guided by her newly adopted villagers, Nwendo grew and became a strong young adult. As Nwendo blossomed into adulthood, her feminine sides became less and less prominent. You could only tell by her face she looked like a lady, but her mannerisms, attitude, and male physique became more prominent. One day, after the village was up for their morning and daily activities, all the men of the village were suddenly plagued with a strange cough, and after a few weeks of the cough persistence, it grew into a fever that started killing them one by one. The village was in panic as it took only the males. Nurses tried to find a cure for the strange disease which only affected men, but they couldn't. Nwendo and some other female villagers gathered, and went to the neighboring villages to get help. But it was the same there, and even worse, as most of the men were already dead, and some all were gone in other villages. When Nwendo and her escorts arrived, they reported the news to the village, leaving the women in shock and desperation, trying to help their sons and husbands to find a cure. But after a few weeks of endless searching, the men started to pass away one by one, until every man in the village was 6 feet fast asleep. News of this spread around, and the strange sickness had killed all the men in every village, not leaving one behind. After a few weeks of mourning and a few months of healing, the women of all the villages needed a way to reproduce and prevent their race from going extinct. But there was no one, not even a single man in all the kingdom. The women in Nwendo's new village approached her, questioning her about the mysteries of her body and the presence of her male organ, and she was persuaded to lay with 3 young women of the village. After a few persuasion, Nwendo agreed, and she knew the women the villagers offered, and after a few months, the 3 ladies were all pregnant. News spread across all the villages and all the kingdoms about a certain woman who possessed powers to impregnate another woman. Women from different villages and kingdoms came in search for Nwendo, and she would pick 3 women from every village to lay with. One day, as Nwendo was getting ready to meet the new visitors, women from another, she realized it was the women from her previous village where she was born, and the woman presenting the 3 volunteering ladies, amongst them, was her mum, Owero. Owero looked at her daughter in shock. "Nwendo, is that you?" she said as she stuttered and began to cry. Nwendo looked at her mum and the women with a sympathetic but bold expression, and after Owero was done crying, she shamefully turned around and left Nwendo and the village, their fate of existence now resting on Nwendo. The moral lesson of the story is accepting the beauty of difference. It comes once in a while, so we shouldn't judge people based on things we can't control and the peculiarity of others. Once upon a time, in the village of Dunbo, there lived a princess named Sad. She was the daughter of King Aid, who ruled his village fiercely and violently. He was nicknamed the Mad Blood Hunter because he loved to kill both his enemies and any villager who offended him. He invented different torture devices to punish his offenders, and if anybody offended him, they would rather unalive themselves than be carried to King Said. On the other hand, was his only daughter. She was very gentle and kind. She was apple of King Aid's eyes, and because of that, nobody in the village wants to be associated with her. Sada lived a lonely life growing up, and she only played with the palace maidens, who also tried their best not to get themselves killed. One night, as Sade slept on her bed, she couldn't help but anticipate what was going to happen the next day, which was her 16th birthday. Every year on her birthday, the king, her father, always killed a lot of animals for her, and everyone must be in attendance, or it would be their turn to walk in Heaven's Gate. Sade wanted her birthday to be casual, but her father, King Aid, always did whatever he wanted. As Sade slept, she had a dream. She saw many people with blood on their bodies coming to touch her. She tried chasing them away, but they were everywhere, and she couldn't move. As Sade woke up, she found blood on her underwear, which made her scared. It was her first period, and she didn't know what to do. As she tried to get up from the bed, her stomach suddenly got tied up in a knot. It was so painful, she let out a scream without control. Her maidens rushed into the room. "What's happening, Princess Sade?" they said, and they were shocked to see the amount of blood from Sade pouring onto the bed. "This is too much," said one of the maidens called Nya. As Enna tried to help Sade, who was still crying in pain up her bed, she let out a scream so loud as the pain intensified and the blood flowing out multiplied. "Princess Sade, you are losing a lot of blood," said Anna, and Sade could do nothing but cry. The other maiden, named Ribi, quickly ran to King Ud, who was already awake from the strange noise he heard. "My king, your daughter Sade is losing a lot of blood," she said as King Ud sprung out from his bed. King Ard ran to Sade's room. As he entered, he saw the floor covered with blood flowing from his daughter. He was in total pain and discomfort, seeing his child in pain crying. "Go and get the local doctors," he shouted, and the maiden ran out of the building, going to call on the doctor. He ran to Sade and tried to touch, but as he touched her, her pain intensified again, and she let out a scream so loud. It woke the entire village. As King Ade stepped back, he could only watch Sade, his precious daughter, battling with pain and losing an insane amount of blood. The local doctor arrived in the palace, and as he saw Sade and the amount of blood on the floor, he stopped in shock.